The brain is a complex and fascinating organ. Like the rest of the body, the brain can be positively and negatively affected by the environment, especially by the neighborhoods in which we live. Today, we'll learn how community violence affects brain function in children. Before we begin looking at different parts of the brain, we first need to define community violence and ask ourselves, just how significant of an issue is it? Community violence is violence perpetrated by people outside of one's immediate family. This is violence that occurs on the streets and in alleys, on the basketball courts and playgrounds, and on the walk to school and at school. In fact, children growing up in high poverty, high crime neighborhoods say that school is one of the places where they feel most unsafe. Community violence also includes bullying, fights among gangs, being chased, being robbed, shootings in public areas, and stabbings. Witnessing community violence creates a positive feedback loop of increasing violence. Witnessing violence causes stress, anxiety, and fear, and leaves children with the feeling that they can't count on adults to keep them safe. Children who lose their sense of safety turn to carrying weapons and being overly aggressive, so other youth and adults won't try to hurt them. This all escalates to bigger and more serious acts of violence. Exposure to community violence has been described as a public health epidemic for children residing in economically disadvantaged urban neighborhoods. It is rare in urban elementary schools to find children who have not been exposed to such negative events. Between 20% and 50% of children in the U.S. are victims of violence within their homes, at their school, and in their communities. One study found that between 75% and 80% of low-income African American youth witnessed community violence ranging from assault to murder. For too many children, these violent acts have become ordinary, everyday events. But before we address that issue, let's dispel 3 common myths about community violence that scientists have proven time and time again simply aren't true. Myth number 1: infants can't feel fear. Infants and toddlers can, in fact, experience fear as early as 6 months old. Infants who witness violence in their communities and homes show excessive irritability, immature behavior, sleep disturbances, emotional distress, fear of being alone, and regression in toileting and language. This means that no child is too young to be developmentally harmed by living in a high crime and high violence neighborhood or being exposed to community violence. Myth number 2: repeated exposure to violence desensitizes people. One study that looked at the effects of community violence on African American youth showed an increase in symptoms of depression as exposure to violence increased. Then, as exposure to violence continued to increase, depressive symptoms decreased. Based on these results, researchers believe that the youth were actively suppressing their depressive symptoms as violence exposure levels reached their peak in order to seem more tough so that they wouldn't be targeted for further harassment or violence. Myth number 3: exposure to community violence can be easily overcome. Traumatizing experiences can have significant and long-term effects on children's brain development. These stress-induced changes to the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functioning of the child can be seen in children as young as 1 year old. These changes do not simply get better with time, but require active unlearning and the learning of new cognitive capacities later in life. Now, let's go back to the brain we saw earlier. Children's exposure to community violence causes toxic stress, which is different from the stress that everyone experiences on a daily basis. Toxic stress is a strong, frequent, and prolonged activation of the body's stress response system. Adults who are exposed to toxic stress as children may have reduced volume in the hippocampus, which is central to learning and memory. Those who have been exposed to toxic stress also tend to have decreased volume in the corpus callosum, which is responsible for interhemispheric communication and processes like arousal, emotion, and higher cognitive abilities. Volume in the cerebellum, which helps coordinate motor behavior and executive functioning, has also been shown to decrease due to exposure to toxic stress. Some studies on adolescents and adults who are severely neglected as children indicate that they have a small prefrontal cortex, an area which is critical to behavior, cognition, and emotion regulation. But there are also other studies that show no difference. Although most studies have found that amygdala volume is not affected by maltreatment, abuse and neglect can cause overactivity in this area of the brain and may make a child have trouble determining if a stimulus is threatening and will often result in an overly emotional response. This can lead to a child seemingly overreacting to a situation, such as a slamming door. Okay, so what can be done to help children that have been exposed to community violence? To answer this question, let's head back to the school that we saw earlier. Schools can play a key role in providing the supports that these students need. Rather than targeting a few students who exhibit highly disruptive behavior in the classroom, schools need to have a system-wide support network to support all students who may have witnessed or been victims of violence. Here are 5 things that schools can do. Number 1. Creating safe spaces. Children living in high violence areas can benefit from having a protected place in the neighborhood. Such safe havens can shield children from exposure to violence and can aid in their resilience. Schools and even community centers can provide opportunities for children to benefit from the support of their peers, which has been shown to be instrumental in reducing anxiety among children exposed to violence. Number 2. Forming deeper teacher relationships with students. Student-teacher relationships have been found to be the key predictor of decreased at-risk behavior. These relationships that were most successful in optimizing resilience in students had 4 distinctive traits: teacher-driven, authentic and caring, attuned to students' emotional states, and individualized. Noticing absences, telling students they were missed, knowing their names, saying hi in the hall, and active listening were identified as the small things that can make the biggest difference. Also, caring and positive relationships with teachers are also important in the development of a child's sense of safety. Number 3. Removing exclusionary discipline. The use of exclusionary school discipline increases the probability of long-term negative outcomes, especially juvenile justice system involvement. These practices and outcomes fall disproportionately on specific populations, particularly students of color. Although exclusionary discipline practices are not necessarily a direct path to juvenile justice system involvement, they negatively impact a student's attitude towards the school, causing them to become disengaged and perhaps begin to skip school. Alternative approaches to exclusionary discipline should focus on recognizing and including student and family voices and reintegrating students after conflict. Number 4. Engage parents. Research has shown that while a child's individual resources and temperament can decrease the effects of violence, family support is critical. However, many parents in high poverty, high crime neighborhoods have experienced the same types of community violence as their children, so it is important that outside supports can provide opportunities for these parents to talk about their own feelings and trauma. After working through their own problems, parents will be more available to help their children. Schools can also act as a platform to get parents involved in their children's lives through teacher conferences, home visits, and phone calls. Number 5. Offering research-based policy recommendations. Child welfare policies and programs need to address the full range of child's developmental needs. Therefore, the policies should focus on both improving children's physical safety and decreasing the emotional and psychological effects of abuse and neglect. Early identification and treatment of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorders in young children should be routinely available through existing services for families. This is important because the key is to intervene early in children's lives who have experienced excessive fear and anxiety in order to decrease the likelihood of a lifetime of poor mental and physical health, diminished economic productivity, and antisocial behavior. In conclusion, exposure to violence physically changes children's brains. But there's good news. With proper attention and practices in schools, the effects of violence can be managed. Successful management strategies focus on understanding the child's experiences and providing emotional support in their schools and homes. It is important to intervene early and often in the lives of young children who are exposed to community violence. That way, children can grow up unburdened by toxic stress and the impacts of community violence, and ultimately grow into healthy and productive adults.